controversial in one way, but it's also extremely relevant, maybe to some of you here, and I believe to everybody in one way or another. And that is the issue of bad religious experiences. Bad religious experiences. What I mean by that is, beginning with people who may have grown up in a secular home, secular environment, and at some point in their lives were inspired to explore, to search for their so-called roots, tradition. This is true, frankly, for all people. It doesn't have to be necessarily Jewish, but obviously my focus here is specifically about the Jewish journey. But as I said, the message is really universal to all. So they begin exploring these roots, and people go at their own different paces, and some choose to embrace Jewish observance, the different levels of it. Orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodoxy, and they are drawn into different communities because part of being observant is to be part of a community, which means there's a synagogue, there are holidays, there are services, prayers. And then, at some point, these experiences, even though initially may have been very pleasant and heartwarming and spiritual, turn sour, where there are either disappointments and disillusionments or other negative experiences, and where the expectations that the individual had are not met, and sometimes much worse than that. Of course, there are many, many scenarios here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. So that's one category of what we call a bad religious experience. And then if it goes further, some continue to explore. They leave one synagogue, they leave one community, they leave one country, go to another. And this is not just about synagogues, also what schools you may go to, different so-called Baal Tshuva schools, or Baal Tshuva being a general cliche for people who are so-called doing tshuva, which means they lived a secular lifestyle and, so to speak, are now returning to their Judaism. As we'll soon address, that too is quite a question, what that really means. So that's one category of, as I said, negative or bad religious experience, which can always get worse, because as one continues to explore, you go to one place to another, there are those that I've met, quite a few, that have ended up nowhere. On one hand, they were deeply touched by Judaism and its message. On the other hand, they really never found their place in any particular community. And especially when you throw into the equation the search for a shidduch, to find a soulmate. So, if one finds a soulmate and you can build a home, it's one thing, but being single and trying to be observant or trying to be committed in some way, it's quite difficult, especially if there's no community at all. So quite a few have ended up somewhat like lost souls. As I said, on one hand, deeply inspired, but on the other hand, not really finding a place or kindred spirits or a group or a community that you could fit in or belong. And many of those that you thought you fit in really ended up disappointing and not living up to standards when you start seeing some of the politics and some of the what initially you may see a lot of beauty. When you get closer, you start seeing that people everywhere have pettiness and all kinds of other called primitive or not such refined mechanisms. So this is definitely an issue that is not really discussed much because people are uncomfortable speaking about it. Obviously, rabbis and teachers and synagogues are not going to speak about a problem that they themselves may be part of. Since I don't have a synagogue, nor really a official community, I'm just like out there in cyberspace. So I can talk about it less risk, so to speak. Then, of course, there's bad religious experiences that take on different shapes, more extreme, where people who actually were abused in the religious environment, where they were coming into, so to speak, a world of higher standards and morality, ethics, were abused by rabbis. This can be all kinds of abuse. I'm not going to go get graphic here, but abuse can be of many forms and fashion, and ultimately abuse that comes from religious source can be extremely disturbing and devastating, because it's one thing if it's coming from a secular place, a godless place. But now that you come closer to God, and then there's abuse, or there's some other form of betrayal, or obviously it's much more disturbing. because this is supposed to be a godly place with godly standards. And then there's the bad religious experience, which really goes into the category of people who grew up in religious homes. And they grew up one fashion, and then they grow older and start looking and searching, and they discover that which they found that they were taught in their homes and schools is not exactly something that they want to continue living by. And that too can include abuse, and it can include corruption and hypocrisy on many levels. So that's a bad religious experience for a person who actually grew up in that environment. Now all this goes under the general title, bad religious experiences. At the same time, it's always important also, in the name of being productive and constructive, it's easy to become bitter and sour and find other people who are bitter, and then you have basically a new club called the Bitter Souls Club, people who've had bad religious experience club. That's not what I'm trying to do here, because that too can be destructive, because you end up not solving any problems. You just begin to have other people who can all complain, and everybody shares their sob stories and how bad things are. Not to dismiss or invalidate those experiences, but it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. So the real goal here is really to get to a place, an empowering place. And I thought I'd like to address this topic, especially this week, because this may surprise you, but actually it's a theme, a big major theme in this week's Torah chapter. Perhaps on a subtler level, and a different level, but as you'll see, there are profound lessons, real important lessons that we can learn from an episode that takes place in this week's Torah portion. And that, namely, is the story of the two children of Aaron. So to just quote a little from the Bible this week's Parsha Shmini. Shmini is the third chapter in the third book of Chumash Leviticus. So Shmini talks about Vahi Bayim Shmini. Shmini means 8, and then came the 8th day. 8th day of what? Last week's chapter talked about the dedication of the temple. If you may recall that in the chronology of the story, the Jews, after they left Egypt, just to put it all in context, and then 50 days later received the Torah. And then close to a year later, from when they left Egypt, almost a year later, they were instructed to build a Mishkan, which means a place where the divine presence rests. V'shachanti b'sochem, God rests there. A Mishkan is a temple, a sanctuary. This would become the model that would later become the temple in Jerusalem. But at this point, they were still in the wilderness, so they couldn't build a permanent structure because they were traveling on their way to Israel. So they built a temporary structure. It was called a portable sanctuary, a Mishkan, which was made it wasn't made out of permanent materials like bricks and foundations and wood. Instead, it was made out of actual material, and skins and things that could be easily transported, easily erected, easily put up, and then like a tent. Actually called Ohel Moed, a tent. Like something that can be easily constructed, easily taken apart, packed and carried. And the Torah describes in detail how it was carried, how it was packed, when they would erect it, when they would set it up. There were different signs when God wanted them to stop in their 42 journeys through the wilderness, and that's when the temple would go. But the beginning of it, the first time the temple became a formal temple, a formal sanctuary, is in this week's chapter. So the last book of Exodus talks about this structure, the building of the temple and the donations, and how Bezalel finally built it. The beginning of Leviticus, last week's chapter, talks about how they began to dedicate it for 7 days. Dedicate it meant there was a special instructions of how to so-called initiate the people in appreciating and introducing the idea, the concept that you now have the divine presence in a physical sense amidst you. Which all will become a model, by the way, for what we call today a synagogue, which is a Migdash Mat, a synagogue in microcosm, essentially. A synagogue is a Migdash Mat, is a sanctuary microcosm, a Migdash. So this week's chapter says, Vahi Bayim Shmini, now came the 8th day, meaning following the 7 days of dedicating the temple with particular offerings, particular prayers, particular customs that were done for those 7 days, that trained essentially Aaron and his children, who were the priests that would serve in the temple. Moses trained them how to serve in the temple. So now comes the 8th day, And it continues, well, now it's actually becoming the first day, it will become the first time, this is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of Nisan, which was coming up, which was the first time that the temple would become an official temple. Not the dedication was over now, Vahi B'yim Hashmini. Begins the process where actually the first day in history that a temple, a physical space in this world became a conduit, a channel for divine presence through the offerings and through the things that the chapter continues to tell about. Then it continues, and it says how Moses and Aaron, who of course were the leaders of the people, especially Moses, how after they do the initial offerings on this 8th day, so it says, Aaron lifted his hands toward the people and blessed them. He then descended from the altar, prepared a special offering and peace offerings. Then the Torah continues and says, Moses and Aaron went into the communion tent, Olmod, which was the central area of the temple. It was the Holy and the Holy of Holies, but this was the larger area, the outer area. And then they came out and they blessed the people. And this is how the Torah, in one sentence, describes this momentous day, this historical day. God's glory was then revealed to all the people. Vayar k'vod Hashem el kol ha'am. As usually the Torah in its brevity, short as long, captures the essence of it. So if you recall, in the beginning, when God tells Moses to build a temple, it says, V'asu li migdash, build for me a sanctuary, a holy place, migdash. Hence the name, Beis HaMikdash, Beit HaMikdash, the house of the holy. V'shachanti b'seicham, that's the mission. And I will rest among you. And now the Torah says, Vayar k'vod Hashem el kol ha'am. That the glory of God, the kavod Hashem, the dignity of God, you can say, it's more than glory, was revealed to the people. So you could imagine this was a very high point. It wasn't a small thing, because this never happened before. Not Adam and Eve, not Noah, not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not all the generations, not even the Jews when they left Egypt, not even at Mount Sinai, achieved this momentous occasion, which was that actual physical space can be turned into a divine, basically a divine presence, where matter essentially was turned into energy, put it in contemporary terms. So you may recall I discussed this often in this class, and it's a central theme. At Mount Sinai, the great event of Sinai was that Sinai married heaven and earth. It gave the human being the power to transform the material existence, our material existence, into something spiritual. Before that, the Medrash says there was a rift, there was a split, a schism, that separated heaven from earth. Heaven from earth meaning here the spirit from the spiritual from the material. So there was a certain limit. It was only that high that a human being could reach. At Sinai, that rift was repaired. There was a bridge created, where from now on, we can actually transform this material existence into a spiritual environment. The consequences of that are not small. It essentially means that we don't have to escape and live an ascetic lifestyle to connect to the divine. There are spiritual systems that demand, or even logically will argue, that in order for you to reach spirit, we have to negate, we have to avoid, we have to deny the material. Many Far Eastern disciplines are based on that principle. And you could even argue the merit of that, because the material existence, whether it's an illusion, or it's ego-driven, or it's selfish, narcissistic, in a way is antithetical to anything that is spiritual and giving, and seeing so-called the higher unity. The fragmented materialism of our universe and of our needs, in many ways, are antithetical to the spiritual unity of seeing the light, so to speak. So you could argue that ultimate goal, if you really want to reach that type of higher truth, you have to some way deny this material world. And there are levels. Different disciplines argue different levels of how much you must deny or reject. Some in extreme would be extreme asceticism, a monk lifestyle, where you literally separate yourself and you're just completely involved in prayer and meditation and communion and so on. And others, more moderate forms of asceticism. But no matter how you twist it, it's always some form of asceticism, some form of compromising the material universe. So in a way you can say till Sinai, from a Torah point of view, that was the way it worked. Look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They all chose to be shepherds. They did not engage the material world. They were shepherds. Shepherds was true, not ascetic in the fullest sense of the word, but it was somewhat spending time in the meadows and the fields, while the sheep are grazing, and they prayed and meditated and spoke to God, and God spoke to them. One could argue it would be impossible to be able to be immersed in so-called Wall Street. Maybe that's not such a good name to use these days, but into the marketplace, the realities of on the ground, and still maintain and still connect and grow with spiritual integrity, one could argue is a very difficult process. So that's all true and fine until Sinai. The Torah says that at Sinai that changed. That God instilled in the universe a power that was always there, mind you, but we weren't able to access it, that lays dormant within materialism, that in this material world, in this table, and these chairs, and the work that each of us does, and the things that you do, and even on the physical level, lies enormous spiritual power. And it's up to us, and we have the power and the ability to access it and to let it free. Essentially, this is the concept in Kabbalistic terminology, what we call birra hanetzutzis, the elevation, the refinement of the sparks. That within all of material existence lie divine sparks, to the point that the Kabbalists will say that the higher the spark, the lower it falls, which really is basically saying that the more materialistic it is, the more powerful energy it has. Using the analogy, for instance, if you have a stone wall, so the stones that are highest on the wall will fall the farthest from the wall if they fall. So in a sense, the most powerful sparks lie in the most material parts of this universe. And therefore, when we, in our life work, in building our own temples, physical temples, essentially our job, our mission is to take the material part of our corner of our universe and transform it into a temple, into a channel that manifests the divine energy within it. That's called elevating, refining, setting free, redeeming the sparks. Sometimes redeeming the sparks. Pidyon shvuim, it's a form of freeing hostages. The sparks are like hostages. They're held hostage in the material universe. The way to do that is, as the Torah discusses in building the temple, it's through selflessness. It's to recognizing it's not all about you. It's not about you acquiring more, you hoarding, which is all a materialistic approach. It's recognizing materialism is given to you, and the material benefits of your life, the gifts, money included, are really tools for spiritual growth. So that's a key component. So to go back to the temple, so Sinai gave us this power. But when did this happen in history for the first time? It's in this week's chapter, in this day, this 8th day. Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the 2nd year after the Jews left Egypt. So they had left the 15th of Nisan, almost a year later, almost a year later, that's when the temple, and that for the first time in history, you have this fusion of matter and spirit, of material and the spiritual. So this was not a small day, it was a major event. So you can imagine that the people, the Jewish people, standing and hearing the prayer and blessing from Moses and Aaron, and then seeing divine glory, whatever form and shape it may have taken, but they clearly saw something very powerful, were quite impressed, not just quite impressed, were quite inspired. The question is, what happened next? And here you'll see, as I said, the first so-called powerful religious experience. So while it's true that Adam and Abraham and prophets and the greats before this day all had their spiritual experiences, all their so-called religious experiences, Adam and Eve, of course, in the Garden of Eden, when they speak to God, God speaks to them. Abraham, when God appears to him. But nevertheless, it never had quite this impact, because then, as Hasidic thought and the mystics explain, it was still mostly on the spiritual plane. It was not really on a material plane. Abraham was a spiritual person. In a sense, he had been able to suspend his material self to be able to communicate with God. But here it was the first time that it actually happens on a material level, because you're talking about a temple, a physical temple. It wasn't just on the mountain or in a meditation or in a prophecy or in a vision. This was a very physical experience. So that's what makes it unique. So the question is, what happened? And you'll see, from what happened here, we'll have unbelievable lessons of how we, each of us, can learn how to truly experience the divine in a healthy way. And we'll address, of course, the direct issue that I began tonight, which is bad religious experiences and bad influences and environments and communities and so on. Now, of course, we can't compare our own experiences, as I'll qualify a little later, to necessarily this height of spiritual revelation, but the Torah is meant to be a lesson to us. Though, yes, our experiences may not be quite standing in the temple and seeing the divine glory quite as it happened then. Nevertheless, in a subtle form, in a more milder form, each of us has similar experiences, as I will discuss. So let's continue and see what happened. So what happened? What happened was, let me continue the next sentence. God's glory, as I said, revealed to all the people. Okay. Is the suspense mounting here? Well, if you read the Torah last year, you would know. But they tell the story of one of the children who got angry when they were reading about Joseph. How Joseph goes out to the fields to find his brothers, and then, of course, you know the story that happens that his brothers, of course, capture him and they want to kill him, and then they kidnap him, and then they end up selling him into slavery, and everything is downhill from there. So one of the children learning Chumash came to them. They say, what's the matter with Joseph? Didn't he read last year what happened to him? Why is he going again to the field? So nevertheless, we're supposed to live with this every year in a new fashion, as if it's just happening now. And every year it's a new type of experience. And yes, we don't really remember how it was back then. And in general, as we all know in our own healthy and unhealthy ways, we repeat patterns all the time. There are many things that we've learned from, and we think, I'm never going to make that mistake again. And then, hey, you do exactly the same thing again. Sometimes different names, different characters, different places, but more or less the same pattern. So, what happens? So the Torah continues. Fire came forth from before God and consumed the offering that Aaron had just made an offering. When the people saw this, they raised their voices in praise and threw themselves on their faces. They basically bowed in complete awe. Because it wasn't, as I said, just a spiritual experience. It's one thing you have a vision, an epiphany, personal. Here was a collective experience. And even though Sinai was obviously the biggest experience of all history, but as I said, Sinai was not transformed. Afterwards, they left that place and they moved on. We don't even know exactly where Sinai is. But here, it was in a physical sense. It was a physical offering, an animal offering. It was a physical temple. They saw something that was very much part of their lives. And as I said, when they saw the fire consume the offering, they were completely blown away. They raised their voices in praise. In Hebrew, the expression is Vayarenu, which is sometimes even the word used rina for song. They broke out in song, basically. And I'm just looking at the translations, the different translations, I'm assuming. Let's see. Kaplan translates praise. What does he say here? Just a moment. Yes, sang out, became ecstatic. That's another expression used, became ecstatic. Which I think is irrelevant. However you exactly interpret it, but it clearly includes a very powerful expression of ecstasy, is the word he uses, ecstasy or song, and acknowledgement, and to the point that they actually literally bowed and fell on their faces, meaning it's the concept of bowing, complete awe, complete subjugation to a higher presence, which would happen to anyone that had a powerful, powerful experience. Okay, now that all makes sense. That seems what a healthy person has a powerful divine experience. That's what would happen. But here's what happens next, and here is where you see how it can go two ways. Before I continue to build the suspense, on one way, what could happen next is that they would continue and build a healthy life based on this experience. Because remember, this inspiration would end. It wasn't going to stay this way. They still have to go back to their lives. The question is, what do they do with this powerful experience? So one thing that's possible is that you build something based on it. You learn how to integrate it, and you grow with it. Another possibility is you forget, which is often what happens. We have many moments of truth, and then we go back to our so-called routines in our lives, and we forget. Yeah, we can maybe remind ourselves, but it's not always maintained. We don't always maintain it. And a third option, as we're going to see, is actually an unhealthy experience. that due to the deep inspiration, instead of learning how to integrate it, you can also get hurt by it. And this is where we'll call the negative religious experience is born. So what happens next? Aaron's sons, two great people, and as the Torah will describe, they were in some ways even greater than Moses and Aaron. So their names were Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons. He had 4 sons. These were the Nadav and Avihu. Each took a fire pan, placed fire on it, and then incense, and they offered it before God. Basically, being so inspired by this divine revelation, and they were also part of this whole experience of the ecstasy and the falling and the awe that they experienced, so they were so inspired they decided to bring an incense, to bring an offering to God. And so far, so good. No problem. Not only that, if you look in the commentaries, especially the Or HaChaim, one of the commentaries right here in these verses, and he says that what happened was, being that they were, of all the people, they were highly spiritual people. So you can imagine, if you're talking about a few million people there, or whatever the number was, there were different types. Everyone had their own particular experience. But you can imagine that the people who are most evolved, the most spiritual of the people, probably had the most powerful experience. So these were they were 2 of them. So the Or HaChaim explained that what they did next, this offering, came out of their deep, the words he uses, their deep love, their deep passion, their deep dveikus, their deep cleaving, connection, wanting to become one with the divine. So this, what they did here was basically a response. Such an experience. They wanted to get closer. And the Torah continues. So they offered it before God. But it was, the Torah calls Eish Zara. Eish Zara literally means a strange flame. You see, Kaplan translates it as unauthorized fire. Interesting way to put it. Like who was supposed to authorize, Yeah, they were, I guess, the bureaucracy then, you needed to go through a whole administrative thing to authorize. But he says unauthorized fire. Now, I understand it means unauthorized by God. They were not commanded to do so. They were not allowed to do so. This was their own initiative, basically, is what he's saying. Let me just see what other translations he brings. In general, just for the record, translation-wise, Hebrew, of course, is hard to translate. But I find that Kaplan is usually most precise in the words and usually gives several options. Whereas other translations, they choose one and they go with that. Not to suggest it's not the right translation, but if you really want to see the diversity, the different ways of translating based on different commentaries, he usually gets a good compendium of that. So what does he say?
How's it spelled?
Zara? Eish Zara. Zayin Reish Hey. Like Zar. Zar is strange. Zara, strange. So, okay, unauthorized. You see Exodus, Ramban. So, okay, he writes, some say they wanted to make use of sacrificial methods that had been in existence before Moses received God's instructions. He means that from Josephus. Okay, fine. But regardless, Eish Zara, the Hebrew definitely, Zara is the word used for strange. In this context, strange fire, I wrote an article about it a few years ago. I think I equated it with, not that they necessarily did it that way. Sometimes people couldn't use drugs. Is a strange fire. It's like a strange psychedelic experience or other forms of drugs. And this, of course, addresses that as well. It can be driven by a good intention to try to reach a deeper place beyond the doors of perception, as Blake wrote. And so Nadav and Avihu, not that Havdil, I don't want to make the comparison, but in their own level, they did something on their own initiative. And then what happens next? So they brought this, as he puts it, the strange fire, which God had not instructed them to offer. Well, the Torah says that specifically. Shalait Sivoisam, they were not instructed to do so. And what happened next was tragic. Another fire came forth from before God, and it consumed them. So they died before God. The Hebrew, V'teitzei eish milfnei Hashem, v'teichel oisam. V'teichel literally means consume, but also v'teichel can actually mean, you say in Hebrew, echila means to eat. It completely consumed them, in other words. And they died before God. See, the key here is it says they died before God. It doesn't say they just died. They died before God, and that's why the Or HaChaim makes such a fuss about the high level of spirituality they were at. This was not some type of dying before God, like they did something disgraceful or defiling the temple, as Lahavdil Titus later would do of Rome. They didn't do something that was inappropriate. On the contrary, they were coming with very powerful, healthy intentions. They were inspired by a very powerful experience. Everything here was pure. We're not talking about some people who came in and decided to use the temple for their own selfish needs. It has nothing to do with selfishness in that sense. It was all about their wanting and need and going to get closer to God. However, they went too fast and they went unauthorized. And basically, their own intentions was their own undoing. They wanted to get so close to the fire that they got consumed by it, basically. So you see here, a fire came from God, but you have to be careful not to get into the fire. You could watch it, you could be warmed by it, not warmed with an M, warmed. You can be illuminated, but you have to be careful whether you're ready to enter. Because if you're not ready, what happens is, as what happened here, that they got burned by it. Not just burned, they literally burned out. First burned out in history, where they actually were consumed to the point that they died before God. So their death, as Moses would later say just to finish this, what happens next, Moses says to Aaron, this is exactly what God meant when he said, listen to this, I will be sanctified among those close to me, and I will thus be glorified. So how's Moses' reaction to the father who just lost his two sons? He was like consoling him. He was saying, this is what God meant, that I will be sanctified by those close to me. That these two brothers, Nadav and Avihu, it was out of their closeness that caused them to enter and ultimately be consumed. And then the interesting final statement here is that Aaron remained silent. Father Aaron, he heard what Moses said, but he remained silent. And that silence, which we'll be discussing as well here tonight, lies, of course, volumes and volumes of messages. The silence. He didn't disagree. If Moses, his brother, told him this is what God meant, that the close ones will sanctify me, so obviously Aaron acknowledged that. But he was silent because the whole episode, the whole experience, was one that really elicits silence more than anything. Or silence rather than words. And then the Torah continues and talks about the process of, first of all, the burial of Nadav and Avihu, and also done with great care. Moses summons several individuals, cousins of Aaron's sons actually, and tells them to go in and bring them out of the sanctuary and bring them outside to the camp where they were ultimately laid to rest. And then continues the laws of where we learn many laws about what's called an oinen, God forbid. When a person loses a parent, there's special laws of avelus, which is laws of a mourner. But before being a mourner, a person is called an oinen. An oinen is someone, before the burial itself, certain particular laws that are different than the laws of general shiva that a person has the day before the burial. And the specific laws which are really derived from all of here, from this story. So what I want to focus on is here, number one is, okay, so we have, as I said, a deeply spiritual experience that leads to a tragedy, essentially. And even though Moses acknowledges and says that this came because of their closeness, a form of sanctification. But what really lies behind the story? What really happened here? So what happened here was, as I said earlier, was two individuals who were extremely highly spiritual individuals, highly divine people, driven by pure intentions, were so inspired, but they forgot the discipline, and they forgot that maybe they weren't ready. In other words, sometimes you can see something powerful in your life, and it can touch you deeply, but if you're not ready to integrate it, you have to go step by step. Because if you don't, the fire itself, the thing that is so powerful and is so healthy, can end up destroying you. So it's an interesting twist, because usually we think of things that destroy us as being negative things, evil things, being around people who are unhealthy, abusive. We don't usually refer to holy fire or divine experiences as being something that can be destructive. So it's important to emphasize that the point here is not that the divine is destructive, is that when you're not ready, it's destructive. So it's our limitations that doesn't allow us to experience it. So when Moses, for instance, great Moses, no one greater than him, The man of God himself says to God, also in a moment of deep inspiration, show me your face, show me your glory. Interesting, the same word he says, Kvoid Hashem, Hareini no kvoidecha. Show me your kavod, show me your glory, show me your dignity, your essence, your face. And God responds, no man can see my face and live. This was not some type of pulling rank or being difficult from God's perspective. That even you, the great Moses, cannot see me directly without being consumed. Because as one of the great mystics and Jewish thinkers writes, actually not a mystic, he's called a chayker, more of a Jewish philosopher, Rabbi Yosef Albo, wrote the famous book called Sefer Ikrim, the book of fundamental principles. So he uses an expression, Ili Yadaitiv Hayisif. In Hebrew means, if I knew him, I would be him. Referring to God. If I knew God, I would be God. Because when it comes to things in our world of duality, so you can know about this table, doesn't make you a table. When it comes to God, which is not duality, but a unity, if you know God truly, you'd have to see everything from God's perspective, then you would be God. So knowing God and being God is one, essentially. So you can know pieces of God, so to speak. Not pieces, but I mean to say manifestations, expressions. But to know God in the fullest sense of the word, you'd have to be God. Which really is true also, just for an example of ourselves. Can someone truly know you and not be you? You can know parts of you. Even people who love you deeply can know a lot about you, can have an intimate understanding of your life. But there's some things that no one will ever know, only you can know, that you know from within, so to speak, from the inside out. Everybody else will always experience you from the outside in. So even when it comes to people, it's that way. That ultimately true knowledge of someone else is only possible if you are that person. When it comes to God, obviously, it's infinitely more so, because you're dealing with an entity that's so far beyond any finite creature. So basically, what Moses was told a few chapters back when he went up on the mountain and he was praying for the Jewish people after they built the golden calf. Well, he wisely asked God. He didn't just barge into the Holy of Holies. And God said to him, no man can see me and live. Whereas Nadav and Avihu, probably not quite necessarily the same level, actually did barge in. They went in, and their inspiration and their love and their connection compelled them to enter into the Holy of Holies, and as a result, being unready, as they saw the face and they could not live, basically, on their level. And they were consumed by the fire. So it's not about the divine, God forbid, being destructive, it's about us, in this case the two sons of Aaron, whether they have the power to contain that type of energy. So on the small examples, just to use small examples that make it a little more relevant. What is the true master, the true art of a teacher, or a good communicator, or for that matter, a good parent? The art is, besides the love, obviously, that is necessary, which is the driving engine behind any type of connection and bonding, but there's something else that goes further than that, that love manifests in a way where the parent, or the teacher, or the communicator does not transmit based on the terms of the transmitter, but always are based on the terms of the transmittee, if you could say that, the recipient. In other words, a good communicator, a good teacher, knows how to gauge the person you're speaking to. You'll find people who are brilliant, they have brilliant ideas, and they may even have good intentions, but they sometimes lose sight of who they're speaking to. They don't know how to measure their target audience. Which, if you want to use business examples for it, of course in business the same is true. You could have a great product, but if it doesn't match your audience, or you're not reaching that particular audience, there's no connection. So the key to true communication is to gauge, is to relate to, is to understand the particular individual that you're communicating with. And no two are the same. Educate the child according to his or her way, and then when they grow older, they will not waver from it. Which really means it's about measuring the container. So if the water of the rainwater, would come gushing down from the heavens, it would flood the fields and destroy them. The same water that sustains and is so vital, so necessary for making things grow, that same water can be destructive if what? Reiv teva eini mechel l'kabel, when it's such a gush of goodness that no one can receive it. In the Talmud, that expression is used in the chapter, in the tractate Tainus, where it talks about the rains, the famines. Always is a tragedy, a famine, because when you're dependent, especially but in an agrarian society where they were so dependent on the agricultural and the seasons, when there was a famine, it was a major tragedy. Today as well, but we're somewhat, in our illusionary industrial world, we're somewhat protected from it because we have food in every season. But in societies where they are directly connected, they're linkedly dependent on the rains, famine is a major disaster. And so the story goes about Cheni HaMagal. It's called Cheni HaMagal because there was a great famine, and he prayed to God for the rains. He finally prevailed, but the rains started coming down in floods. They were drowning the fields. So he had to have pray an additional prayer to ask, and he said, Reiv teva ein yechelim l'kabel. Too much good we cannot receive, we cannot contain. So if you have a cup, you want someone to pour you water that fits into the cup. If you pour too fast, too much water, what will happen? You'll end up with no water. Try it out. That experiment. When you get home tonight, turn on the faucet full force, put a cup there, just like that, you'll end up with almost no water in the cup because it's pouring so fast, it just doesn't let anything remain. So the key is that the transmission be so-called spoon-fed, and to fit the needs and the parameters of the container. This is called in Kabbalistic language Eres B'Kelim, where the light is contained by the Kelim. What happens when the light is too strong? What happens? So either, as I said, it spills out and the container remains empty anyway, or what's worse, it breaks the container. And here is the concept in Kabbalah of what we call the breakage of the containers. You may have heard the expression Shvirat HaKelim. Shvirat HaKelim, literally breaking of vessels, of containers. And it's refers to, actually, and associated with Nadav and Aviv, that the light was too strong for the containers. So the fire consumed them. So why was it called a strange fire? Strange to them. The fire itself, to the one who's able to contain it, is not strange at all. But if you can't relate to it, it's strange. You're not ready for it yet. You have to work harder to build your containers, to expand them, to contain the light. So what's the true process of education then? The process of education is slowly as I said, spoon feed the child. You teach them stage by stage. As the child masters, as the student masters the first stages of a comprehension, then you see the so-called containers expanding, that you can give more light. And even in the light that you're transmitting at this moment also contains deeper levels, of course. But the student is not overwhelmed by it. What happens with time is as the containers expand, they're able to contain much more light, to the point that one day the student can be just as great as the teacher, if not greater. And all this would not have happened had it gone too fast, had the process happened too quickly. So the irony or the paradox here is that pacing it is vital for the success. If you, with good intentions, say, you know what, maybe the student is ready for more than they may think they are, and with good intentions, you may end up destroying to the point where the student will never be able to expand the containers, because sometimes it's irreversible. For instance, if someone brilliant overloads the person he's communicating with, then there's some damage can be done, not necessarily physical damage, but the person may not want to go there again, or they may be so overwhelmed they can't entertain the possibility to engage this level of type of discourse. So this critical pacing is vital to the whole process of absorbing and ultimately integrating. Now, I can't tell you how many pages and pages, thousands of pages are written on this theme, especially in Kabbalistic and above all Hasidic thought. On all levels, this is how God communicates with human beings. This is how human beings should communicate with each other. This has implications in every area where we interact with each other. From education, as I mentioned, to love, how we love each other. Sometimes a person can really have deep love inside of them, but it's all about them. and they're wanting to give, and not recognizing the other person can't contain so much love, or there has to be, can frighten somebody. It's not just about you. Love is also about understanding there's another individual who has to be able to receive it. So it can come from a very good intention, but if it's not done, paced properly, it does the same type of damage. As I said, the list goes on. You can apply this to any area, literally any area. Communication, love, education. You can find even business models for this. How you, for example, develop branding in a company. How you communicate to audiences, to people. If you overwhelm, you ultimately always do more damage. The key is to know how to go fast enough, but not too fast. Sometimes you can also go too slow as well. So of course, it's a constant balance and monitoring that's necessary. And sometimes you may hear the expression where you say chesed and gvura, they balance each other out. Chesed is just outpouring of kindness and love, and gvura is the discipline, the measuring, the tempering that makes sure that the chesed is contained properly. Again, the goal here is not to stop the flow. The goal is to contain the flow, to absorb it, that it can do something for you. So when it comes to Nadav Avihu, they are like the classic example of Shvirat HaKelim in this earth. Great lights, but the light was too strong for the containers at that moment. So when Moses says, this is exactly what God meant, that these are people who sanctified. So in the process, something deeply was taught to us, how strong divine light can be. But they unfortunately sacrificed themselves in the process. But obviously, this becomes a lesson for the generations, because as the Torah continues, it tells us later how God says to Moses, and Moses tells Aaron, now that we've seen what has happened with your two sons, now we know and we learn how to enter the Holy of Holies. So from this story, the second part of it, continues in this chapter and also 2 chapters from now. Achrei Moshe means after the death of Aaron's two sons, talks about all the laws of Yom Kippur, how the high priest was instructed to be very precise in how he entered into the Holy of Holies. All this we learned from because we saw how people entered in the wrong way. Now, this is not to say, you could argue, did Nadav and Avihu sin? Did they do a sin or not? Some say it wasn't a sin at all. Some say the problem was it was too big of a mitzvah. Even a mitzvah also has to have its limits. It can't be too holy. Others do say it's a sin because the bottom line is they were not commanded to do so. They were not instructed to do so. They went on their own volition and ended up, as I said, getting killed, which was not definitely. Torah never allows anybody to commit suicide. Well, it wasn't intentional, but to kill themselves, to be harmed in the process is always considered to be something wrong with that. Except 3 instances where a person has to give his life. That's not relevant to this discussion. So, ultimately, you could argue Nadav and Avihu were also somewhat selfish. Not in the regular conventional term of it, because they didn't do anything here for selfish gain, in the sense financial gain, or abusing anyone, or hurting anyone. But you could say they were spiritually, in a way, selfish. Instead of having the humility to ask and to wonder, maybe, are we ready to go? They just went right into the temple, the Holy of Holies. So I don't want to use the word selfish because it has those negative connotations, but you know what I'm saying. It was driven more, it was there, for them, self-interest was spiritual growth. It was getting close to God. There's even a very interesting, which is unrelated directly to this, but just to mention because it's just interesting. Time of the Second Temple, later, there was corruption. To the point that there were people who had money, and they paid off some of the priests to allow them to go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Now they knew they would go, they would die. Because the Holy of Holies, as the story in this case goes, was so pure that anything that was impure could not survive. It just was too powerful of a place. I think I mentioned this many times, just to use an example. For instance, a piece of dust on your finger doesn't mean much, but a piece of dust on your eyeball is very irritating. The Holy of Holies was like this spiritual vortex of deep sensitivity that if anything there was inappropriate, if a high priest had one blemish, he would die on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies. That's why the high priest that went into the Holy of Holies would go in with They'd be tied with chains, with ropes, because no one else was allowed to go in. So if something happened to them, they had to be pulled out. So you can imagine on Yom Kippur, before the Kohen Gadol would enter the Holy of Holies, he was bound in ropes. And there was a Kohen Gadol like Yechon Kohen Gadol and others that for years and years, decades and decades, every year they survived. It can just show you how pure they were. But there were people in the time of the Second Temple, the Talmud says, and think of the bizarreness of this. They paid money just to have that moment of divine experience, knowing that they would die. So were they corrupt people or they were not corrupt people? It's an interesting twist here. They didn't pay for some type, they paid to have a divine experience. And they knew that they would die in the process. So just give you some food for thought. Obviously it was not something that, I'm not suggesting this is, I'm not encouraging this, not that we can do it today, I don't know if anybody has access to the Holy of Holies. But to go back to this story and to our relevance to what I was talking about, bad religious experiences. So I want to now address it in our relevant terms. So Nadav and Avihu, they essentially, as I said, the mistake was that they moved too fast. And as a result, Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. Sometimes the expression used in the Hasidic discourses to explain the story is the term that I've introduced here quite a few times, called Rotzei and Shuv. The term, if you haven't heard it before, Rotzei v'Shuv. It's a term used, it's a verse in the book of Ezekiel, where he's talking about his vision, his divine vision, and he uses an expression that he sees v'hachayis rotzei v'shuv. He sees the energy, hachayis, energy, life force, rotzei v'shuv, running to and fro. As a matter of fact, in that same verse, he also uses a word that later became the Hebrew word for electricity, chashmal. Why is electricity called chashmal? It comes from a mystical vision of Ezekiel, who saw, he says, the energy flowing back and forth. Electricity is basically a polar, the two poles, negative and positive. You'll always see the symbol of lightning as an example of negative and positive energy. So chashmal is used in that verse, and that became the root why we use chashmal in Hebrew for electricity. So what's Rotzei v'Shuv? Rotzei v'Shuv literally means to run. Rotzei can say is Rotz, to run, and Shuv, to return. But a little more sophisticated English, it really means Rotzei is a form of yearning for something, deeply yearning and wanting something, passionately wanting something. And Shuv is the ability to contain it, to integrate it. Sometimes Rotzei can be defined as tension, and Shuv as resolution. You'll see in all healthy life experiences, for any of us, you always need a measure of tension and a measure of resolution in your life. People who have too much tension and less resolution, there's too much anxiety. And there are people who have too much resolution and not enough angst, not enough tension. And those people are usually complacent and lethargic, don't get anywhere. So you need to have something you look for, you're searching for, but not to the point where there's complete, there's so much yearning, so much passion that you can't contain. So you talk about Nadav and Avihu, what happened was their rotzei became too powerful for their shuv. They had more rotzei, they had more yearning and passion, and they had less containers, shuv, to contain. In the healthy balance, you need both. When a high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, doing exactly what Nadav and Avihu did, he brings incense in the Holy of Holies. But besides the fact that he's commanded to do so, it's also because he's ready to do so. He's able to contain it. So what they did was not per se wrong, it was that they were just not at the place, not ready yet for it. This concept of Rotzei v'Shuv, if you apply it to your own life, you'll see a fascinating way of looking at yourself. Because if you look, you'll see you usually have one more than the other. Very few people have the perfect balance of the two. Our struggle, our challenge is to find the balance. You'll find either too much complacency, too much resolution, everything is resolved. And like someone says, so is there anything that you're like looking for, searching for? I'm pretty happy. Whether it's true or not is another story. Sometimes we decide we want to be happy because we're just too burned out by too being unhappy, by wanting things. So you decide you just don't want anything anymore. Then there's the other extreme, a person who's so hungry that they just are constantly in that type of state. Too much angst turns into anxiety. Too little angst turns into animal bliss. Now I know if you had to choose between the two, I'm sure some would choose bliss over the other. But the fact is, for a healthy human being, one without the other is really not healthy. Think of it like climbing a ladder. If you try to climb too many rungs at once, you're not going to get anywhere. You may even fall. You have to climb one rung at a time, and you look up and you see what broader horizons, which should create a yearning, a hunger to get there, but the hunger to the point where you pace yourself as you grow toward that place. And that's a key to all growth in life. So in a strange way, the more passionate a person you may be, the more energy you have, the more drive you have, the more hunger, may be unbelievable virtue. People that have that have a lot of power. But it could also work against you if you don't pace it, if you don't know how to also have some resolution, some absorption. No different than I said earlier about a teacher or a parent or someone who loves you and overwhelms you with information or love or waters that flood the fields. So this is true with ourselves as well. This isn't just how you communicate with others, it's how you communicate with yourself. That when you have a voice inside of you, a soul inside of you that wants things, and we all have times we want things. I'm not even getting into now whether it's a healthy thing or not. I'm just talking about the concept, conceptually, the idea of being passionate for something, which is in essence a healthy thing, to have passion. However, a vital component, as I said, is pacing it. And the more passion you have, the more pacing is required. If you're hypothetically more, I don't want to say anybody's mediocre, but if anybody's less driven, so in a way the risk is less. Because then the risk is the other way around, that you're too complacent, too apathetic, too blasé or non-driven. So that challenges, that's too much shuv without a rotzeh. In the case of Nadav and Avihu, as I said, the problem was the other way around. There was too much rotzeh and too little shuv. So, if you want to gauge a person yourself, a pretty good way to look at is these two elements in your life. Then there's another discussion, what it is that we're driven for. Some of us are hungry for the wrong things, and sometimes for destructive things. That's another discussion. What I'm discussing here, however, is that balance and pace. So now let's apply this all, going back to this is nice biblical discussion about Nadav and Avihu, and about communication and love. But where it gets a little more, controversial and I guess spicy, juicy, is in the area how we apply it to this discussion I began about bad religious experiences. So, if you ask some of our famous self-proclaimed atheists of our generation, they'll tell you whether it's Hitchens and God is not great, or Dawkins, what is it called, the God delusion or whatever it is. They'll tell you about all the vices, how religion has basically destroyed human beings and destroyed communities, destroyed nations. Religion is the single greatest evil in history. And they make arguments that are sometimes more religious than the most religious fanatics. But, on the other hand, I cannot say that all their points are wrong. There are many things about religion, if you study it objectively, that are very repulsive. When you see, for example, what people did to each other in the name of God or religion, some of the worst things were perpetrated. Until this day, we are dealing with a radical dimension in Islam, fundamentalists that feel that to kill others and kill themselves is part of a type of holy war. I'm not getting into how many there are that way, whether it's all of Islam or not, that's not relevant. There are definitely people that think that way and have changed the landscape of the world as we live in as a result. But they're not the first, to be honest. There were those that were much worse than they. When you think of some of the Christian crusades, especially in the Middle Ages, that were waged, it was essentially the same idea. By the sword, to force religion down other people, and literally kill anyone that will not comply, do not baptize themselves or convert to their way of thinking about God. It's very relatively new, the concept that we in the United States have and has spread throughout the world, the idea of all people are created equal, and freedom of religion, you can choose to believe or not believe, or how you want to believe, on what level. It's a relatively new phenomenon, just a few hundred years old. But if you look at the history, talking about millennia, you see religious wars in the name of religion, in the name of God. Then they asked Chao Enlai, the Chinese leader. So when Nixon went there and China first opened up, China has a very ancient civilization, far longer than the West. So reporters, journalists asked him what he thinks about the American and French Revolution. So he said it's too early to tell. That's interesting, That's true. So the concepts of as what we take for granted were not the story of history. So if you think of it that way, you could make a strong argument religion has been a major force of destruction. What about on an individual level? One could also make that argument. And don't leave here before I finish, because I may end up sounding to you like one of these atheists. So I have a second half of this. I'm saying this also to the web audience. But I'm first playing the devil's advocate. I think it's appropriate. The word devil's advocate, devil, here is good. On an individual level, you can say the same is true. Some would strongly argue that religion is driven by the C word, conformity. It demands, by its inherent rules, a conformist attitude, that these are the rules of God. If you break them, you'll be punished. If you break them, you break the community, you break family, you break homes, and so on and so forth. I mean, I may be overly simplistic in the wording, but the idea is that essentially individuality and just your own free-spirited search for things does not work in the context of religious context, because religion has requirements. And to defend religion, some will say, and it's not what I would say, but this is some would say, well, something that may be true, but if you weigh the two, letting everybody in this world doing whatever their heart desires, as opposed to creating some type of moral higher divine law, I prefer, or maybe we may individually not prefer it, but it may be more logical. Yeah, you have to compromise certain of your own so-called self-interest for the larger good of the community, or the larger good according to God's law. So arguments can go back and forth, but you could also argue, then where do you draw the line? So what happens to our individuality based on that? Even though that may be true, so what does that mean? That we all basically have to annihilate our individual interests and our creativity and that free-spirited nature that we have, all in the name of a higher law? And then, of course, the bigger question, who decides what the higher law is? What happens when two religious communities, each one says, well, I know what God wants, and the other one says, I know what God wants. So then we're back to square one, where they end up massacring each other. Everyone's claiming that they're speaking in the name of God. So yes, an argument could be made if we actually knew what God said, if everyone can agree that this is what God said, an argument could be made that sometimes you have to sacrifice certain self-interest for the higher good. Everyone would argue that, even the atheists would argue that. That's basically the rule of law in the United States. There's certain things that are just not permitted according to law, even though you may want to do it because it hurts others, or it hurts the collective good. For example, the government will insist on preventing someone from committing suicide. Even if the individual has no family and no children and no one dependent on them, they'll mobilize the police and the fire and then the fire department and spend resources to not allow someone to kill themselves. Why? Because the consensus, for whatever reason, right or wrong, of this country is that a society like ours has some type of law that the person who's doing that is being self-destructive and destructive to others. He must not be in his right mind, or something might be wrong if we allow something like that. Now you could argue, if you're a real libertarian, you could argue that that's not appropriate, not hurting anyone else. Why are we getting involved? The debate rages. I'm not here to get into that debate. The point I simply want to make is that this discussion of individual sometimes having to compromise is even true in secular law. This isn't just a religious concept, just as a footnote. But let's go back to this religion. So a great argument can be made that religion has has introduced many negative things into society. Now, if you apply it to our contemporary world, I can tell you firsthand the horror stories, hundreds that I've heard from people who grew up in religious homes, who will say that religion was just a cover, a front, that their parents weren't really religious. They were just programmed, and they tried to program the children. They were unhealthy people. And that religion could be a force that has nothing to do with God or higher morality or spirituality. It's just another mind control thing. I've heard the stories from many people, and I've seen it firsthand in many ways myself. So I can't deny that. And then, as I said at the beginning of this class tonight, there are people who grew up in secular environments, were attracted to Judaism, and then when they came too close, started seeing things they don't like that much. And they started saying, hey, it's not much different. The secular world has its problems, the religious world has its problems. And the list goes on. I can define it more in detail, but I think you can fill in all the blanks yourselves. So why is all this relevant to our discussion here? I'll tell you why it's relevant. Because the way I would put it is that religion really has two aspects to it. There can be a very unhealthy element to it. And I wouldn't call that religion, frankly. That's just things that masquerade in the name of religion. I'll go a step further. I never liked the word religion in the first place. Because the whole word to me, I don't even know what it means. Like I always wondered, even as a kid, when you say somebody is a person, and then there's a religious person. So what does that mean? So one person is human, and the other person is not human but religious? Like, if religion is reality, and like makes you more of what you should be, then you're more human. Why is it called a human being and a religious human being? Religious human being almost sounds like a superimposed adjective that's like suggesting something of an aberration. It would be, to me, if God has any meaning, God's meaning is that God created the human being in the divine image. And when you live up to that image, you're being the most you can be, not some other thing. Like, oh, here's a human, and here he became religious or something like that. So the word itself, to me, is a very strange word. It's an adjective that suggests something else than what it really should be. It should be like it's being the most human you can be, the most divine you can be. So the word to me in general is a very strange word. I just wanted to say that as a qualification. But when I'm using it here, obviously I'm not talking about it in that context as a type of group, which is one of the big stereotypes, is religious people. It's a group called religious people. I'm repulsed by that concept. When people look at me that way, I feel insulted. Like, you know what I mean? I'm a human being like you, 1 second. So you're like the mainstream normal human beings, and there's religious people, and then there's the ultra-Orthodox that go with beards and yarmulkes, which is essentially the ultimate stereotype where we all start judging each other by what we look like instead of who we are. So I have no doubt that there are many people that look like me and call themselves religious people, so therefore I inevitably become thrown into that group whether I like it or not. But since here I have the floor and I can defend myself, or I would rather say not defend, I don't feel defensive, but present myself, I want to present it the way I understand it, the way I was taught what it meant. And that without any stereotypes. So in that context, what the religious means, yes, there are negative things associated with religious experiences, as I've mentioned some of them, and I'm sure there's many more that I haven't mentioned. And then there is what we'll call, how I understand it, what true religion really means. As I said, with the qualification, I don't really want to use the word religion, but I'm saying true faith, being truly a godly person. And that comes down to understanding that God and God's laws are not superimposed states on our beings. It's not like you are who you are, and then comes a Torah and says to you, listen, you're interested in eating anything you like to eat? No, I'm going to tell you you can't eat anything. Here are the things you're not allowed to eat. Here are the things you are kosher, non-kosher. As this chapter discusses, actually. Or you think you can love any way you like and sexuality expressed in any way you like? No, here are the regulations. And the list goes on with every law, Shabbat, kosher, love, marriage, all the laws of prayer, holidays, on and on and on, all that regulate how you live your life. So you have to ask yourself the question, why would you want to embrace a life that is being regulated by some other law that someone's telling you is the name of God? So yes, if you believe that God said so some people say, listen, if God said so, then I'm ready to subjugate myself. That's what God wants, that's what I do. But even that, as you'll see in a moment, is really not a right attitude. The ultimate reason is the following, is the opposite way. If God created life, and created you and I, He created this machine called life, and the Torah is a blueprint, or you can call it an operator's manual, how this machine should be used. So the laws are not superimposed at all. The laws are basically the engineer of life is telling you how life should be lived to the healthiest and fullest way. So this isn't about superimposed, do this and don't do that, because some outside force called God is telling you to do it. But it's actually about within. It's how you structured. So if someone said to you, eat these foods and you'll be healthier. And if you eat these foods, it'll be poisonous and be destructive to you. And you know, it's been proven that this is toxic, this is non-toxic, this is healthy. You're not going to say, well, why are you imposing upon me what I should eat? You're going to say, what do you mean? This has been studied, this is what enhances life. This food is destructive, this food is nourishing. The same is the way the Torah works. The Torah is not about superimposed laws that come from the outside that regulate our lives. It's essentially telling us how how this machine can work to the best way possible. And if one relates to it from internally that way, it's a whole different experience. Then you wouldn't even call it religious. You'd call it being human, being the best you can be, being me. What greater thing can a person be than actualize who I am? That's what the Torah comes to teach us, how to actualize who you are, and not to do things that will undermine who you are. Now, you may not appreciate it right away. That's why you need to study it, step by step. So this is what I would call a true religious experience, a divine experience. The problem with communities and synagogues and many of the environments, and without mentioning names so there's no lashon hara and no one should be offended, because everyone could always say what I'm saying is referring to a different synagogue, you know? Is that a warning from above? Huh? Did I say something wrong?
No.
I didn't mention any synagogue. I didn't say which one. As I said, everyone can say it means a different. He's talking about that rabbi. Okay, you know. So everyone fit the hat as they see fit. One of the big problems is, and this goes back to the story with Nadav and Avihu directly, is that it's become a country club approach, where like a bureaucracy, everybody's interested in the business, so to speak, of it. So it creates a divisive element where everyone is, our synagogue or our environment is the right one. One problem. If it's truth and it's God, then it's not about a particular country. This is not McDonald's, Wendy's, and the Burger King competing. The second problem, and this may be even more important, the way, the attitude often of how so-called kiruv, they call it, bringing Jews closer to Judaism. So the word kiruv is a very, very popular word, but it's also a very disturbing one, and it's really a distortion. Why is it a distortion? Because it's suggesting you're close, and you're going to bring other people close. Like, who made you close? How do you know you're close? It's a very arrogant and condescending attitude. The truth is, we are all human beings, and there's only one God. So if you're saying you're helping someone, give them a book to read and help inspire them, maybe they can get closer to God, it's between them and God. But as soon as it's a group or an individual bringing others close, you have to start wondering who's exactly in charge here. Who gave them the authority? And who made them the babysitters? Which is often the attitude that you have to people who know less. Oh, they know less, they're nebach, they were born that way, so we will bestow upon them our benevolence of bringing them closer to God. This is a fundamental flaw in the whole approach, and this has really nothing to do with God at all. It's to do with people's own maybe needs, and maybe they convince themselves they're closer to God. A third problem is this: the people who feel that the whole idea of doing mitzvahs in this world is about like a frequent flyer club. You collect points. You collect points, and you do this, you get more points, less points. What point? The points for Olam Haba, for the world to come. So it's not about bringing the divine into this world and transforming this world. It's about more points. So of course, a guy grew up in a frum world. He has already many more frequent flyer miles. Now you, a secular person who doesn't have the points yet. So here's how you can accumulate points faster. But if you understand life, that God put us all here, and we did not choose which child should be born into which home. Why some children are born into so-called observant homes, and some are born into secular homes. This is God's plan. Maybe everybody has a role here to play in revealing the divine. It's not about how many points you have. Maybe the person who was not given that many spiritual opportunities has more points than everybody simply because of their challenges. I don't even want to use the word points. Now, all these issues I just mentioned are all flaws that fundamentally are unfortunately become part of mentality of many of the so-called Kiruv schools and Baal Tshuva schools and teachers and communities. And maybe it's the default position when it's driven by a simplistic approach. But when you understand that we are all souls on this earth, and each of us created in the divine image, and that the Torah is really a blueprint to help us all actualize that, then we're all in the same boat, and we're all here to help each other. And just because some people have more information than others, that's good. They're blessed with that. They should be humble and share what they know. But there are others who have other things to contribute that can be equally valuable. Yes, it's true, I'm sitting here and I'm speaking. I was blessed, had the opportunity to study. I grew up in a spiritual Jewish environment, non-judgmental, and I had the opportunity. Some of you may not have had the opportunity, but trust me, I don't feel 1 second that I feel I have more points than you, because you have things to contribute to me that can be far greater than what I could share with you. And I know this this is not just potentially so, I have first-hand experience. I can testify here that I believe I've learned from many of you things that much more than I think you learned from me. Maybe you may argue with that, but so we can argue. But the point is, right, I still feel that way. Because it's more complicated than just a linear approach to things. We're all here to try to connect as musical notes, each indispensable musical note in God's composition. If someone doesn't understand that in a humble fashion, they're missing the whole point of the Torah. No question about it. This attitude that some are closer to God than others is, yes, it's true, there are tzaddikim. There are people who, because of their transparency, their selflessness, have become transparent channels, but they don't go around announcing it. That's something we acknowledge simply when you see them. You see that they, by choice, have made themselves less egoistic. But anyone who's making such announcements and saying, come line up to me because I'm like a tzaddik, I would wonder what kind of tzaddik that is. So when you talk with that approach, and now let's go back to the story with Nadav and Avihu, you'll see how it all applies. Problem is that we may see beauty and warmth in Judaism and in Jewish communities, especially when you, by contrast, look at your life, let's call it in the secular world, and you see the emptiness there. So there's great attraction to it. But don't ever think, and this is something I've always attempted to do in this class, that world is perfect. It may have elements of Torah in it, and there may be people, and there's no question that there are gems there, but we all live in a very imperfect world. And I think it's vital that a person has to understand that in your spiritual path, only you are responsible. There's no person that can babysit for you, can teach you. They can teach you, inspire you. The best teachers will show you how you're responsible. Anyone that in any way causes you to clip your wings or in some way assumes responsibility for you is trouble. If you're 2 years old, that's the case. But not when you're 20 years old or 30 years old or 40 years old. Great teachers will inspire you. And what I find is a lot of the problems come is because you see beauty and truth, and we do the mistake that Nadav and Avihu does. You jump, and then you get burned. Not because necessarily the fire is bad fire, because you're not ready for it. And I think it's vital that people go step by step by step. And learn. Step by step doesn't just mean that you learn about the divine, it's also you learn about people. You learn about communities, you learn about that some people can be very religious in their external dress and their words, but necessarily internally they may not be so evolved, or so divine. And all this is part of the learning process of how to integrate the divine into this world. So there's no community or particular group or synagogue, you're going to find that it's going to be like, this is it. When Mashiach will come, that will be the case. Today you're going to find there's individuals that some of them get it and some don't. Is there beauty in Judaism? There's no doubt. You go to Shabbos tables, you'll find a lot of beauty. But sometimes if you are seduced by that, and have not yet built the tools to make a life for yourself with that, you can get burned. So the lesson of Nadav and Avihu, I think, is quite vital. Not in any way to slow down. To dampen our enthusiasm, curb our enthusiasm, but rather just to measure it, to make sure it's mature decisions you're making, to own your decisions, to grow into it. Now, if I was able to communicate to everybody about it, I think that it would help quite a few people, because I find some people who I meet in the middle of their journey, and they've already jumped too fast, embraced something, and I can tell you countless stories where I hear stories where someone completely trusted the rabbi and the rebbitzin, or they trusted this in the synagogue, and they trusted what some people told them, and then time after time they were all disappointed. Now, had I met them before they trusted them, I would have said, listen, I'm not telling you they're bad people, but take what you can and take it step by step. Don't jump into anything. This is not about a contract that you have to sign. No one's putting pressure on you that you have to buy it all hook, line, and sinker. This is about a relationship with God. And right now, here's where you are. And God understands where you are. And speak to God about it. Look around and look soberly at people and study them and let them teach you. But don't ever jump too fast, because if you jump too fast, it's not yours. It's someone else's. And if it's someone else's, you will not really ultimately grow. If anything, it will regress. And I see quite painfully quite a few people who have been even to this class. And I clearly told some people, do not do certain, don't go so fast, don't become so religious. And they ended up being mezuzah kissing. They couldn't find enough mezuzahs to kiss. And just to use as an example, I have no problem with kissing a mezuzah. I think it's beautiful. But if it becomes more dominant than anything else, I also have this thing like, and I'm not, again, every person in their own pace. A lot of people I know, I remember them as Frank or Mark or John or whatever it is. That's the men's names, then there's other women's names. And then they come to me that their name now is Pesulei Dvora or something. No problem, I always respect it. But I said, do you mind if I still call you Elizabeth or whatever? I say, you're a rabbi, you started my whole journey. How could you do that, And I try to explain it to them. I said, look, you were once Elizabeth, right? There was a part of that life. What do you think? You're going to amputate your whole past? I remember you then. I thought you were a very nice person then too. Now that you grow, great. Again, I don't want to dismiss Hebrew names. It's not at all what I'm trying to say. But it becomes sometimes a point where you have to earn your way when you're ready to use a Hebrew name. When your whole life is through and through divine, and you can show that you paid the price and you own it, then there's no problem. But if it becomes more important than the rest of you growing into that, then there's a certain dissonance. There was a man who came once to the Rebbe, and he comes in. It's the first time he came from London. His name was Zalman Jaffe. And he was a businessman, a London English businessman. One of the Chassidim had an influence on him, and they suggested he go see the Rebbe in New York. So he came, and when he came in, the Rebbe offered him a chair. So he wouldn't sit down. And the Rebbe said to him, I'm very uncomfortable if you're going to stand. And I sit. He said, I can't sit down. I can't sit. The Rebbe says, why can't you sit down? Just tell me. He says, I can't tell you. I promised I wouldn't tell you. The Rebbe said, listen, I won't tell him if you don't tell him, So he said, well, the Chassid Rabbi, whoever the Chassid was, told me, when you stand by a Rebbe, when you come into a Rebbe, you have to stand. A Chassid stands in front of the Rebbe. So the Rebbe smiled and said to him, you think you're a Chassid already? Because you came in here. He said, you have to earn your way to be a Chassid. You sit. And when you become a Chassid, then you'll stand. Okay? In other words, so that's what he did. Then at some point, I guess he just made the decision. You have to earn your way to... Now again, I'm not suggesting here, I'm not telling anyone any rule, what you should embrace, what you shouldn't embrace. I'm just talking about a general principle of life. You have to remain human and remember that God loves you on all levels of your life. Now that you have more awareness and you're inspired by something, absolutely. Look here, Nadav and Avihu, they saw the fire of God, they saw the glory. They were also deeply inspired. And they actually had containers. They were not the newcomers. They paid the price heavily. These were great, great people. Yet even for them, they went a little too fast, and look what happened. So how much more so we can learn for ourselves. Now the point of the message here is not about going slow. The point is that owning it, having the humility of recognizing that just because you got inspired doesn't mean you're there already. It just simply means that if you're really inspired, so now pursue it, explore it, own it. And as you own it, it becomes part of you, integrated in your life. And this is, I'm concerned with it because I see, with good intentions, rabbis and rebbitzins and teachers and synagogues, they want membership or they want people to coming. And I'm not even saying that in a negative way. And they may even mean the good intentions of the people. But there's not enough emphasis on teaching people how to integrate it. And ultimately, the long term, I'd rather hear somebody went slower, and at the end of it, they own it, and live now healthy lives, and build homes, and so on. Don't have to keep running to their rabbi every time they have a question about every detail, than someone who jumped in all of it, because usually what happens is a few years later, they're not necessarily in that place. I hardly find somebody stays. There's no plateau like that. And I remember a guy came to this class. He was stand-up comic, and he would and he began to keep shop. He started this class studying this class, and he began to go to different tables, homes for Shabbos, Friday night, and he liked it. And he came to consult with me. He said he has a dilemma. He really likes Shabbos, and he wants to embrace it. However, his work, being a comedian, is Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night. The bookings. He doesn't know what to do. So I thought about it. It was years ago, and I told him the following. I said, look, there are going to be rabbis that will tell you. I never have a simple answer anyway, so it wasn't yes or no. I said, there will be rabbis that will tell you that, listen, God said in the Torah you have to keep Shabbos. God's the one that provides parnasa, livelihood. There's no way that if you follow God's will, He won't provide for you. I can't argue with that, I told him. But I don't know if you're ready for that truth. Then there are rabbis that will tell you, listen, we can find loopholes, the microphone. Some say it's not such a prohibition. Some say you walk to the place, you get paid after Shabbos. We'll tailor Shabbos to your needs. And anyway, you never grew up with Shabbos in the first place, so it's not so bad. At least you're doing it in the spirit. You'll eat sholent. So, etc. I'm just giving examples. And I said that approach, of course, I absolutely don't agree with, because that's what he tailors Shabbos to everybody's particular needs. So I'm going to tell you the third answer, which you're not going to like. I'm telling you now. But I believe is the true answer. My answer is the following. I will not tell you what to do. You're going to have to answer that question and take the responsibility yourself. I can teach you what Shabbos is. I can teach you the consequences of keeping Shabbos, the consequences of not keeping it. But whether you should embrace it or not is your decision. You're an adult, and you have to make a decision. So he says, why can't you just tell me the first, I just want to have your push, your blessing, encouragement. And I said to him, I'll tell you why. Because I may tell you to keep it, and you'll say, oh wow, Rabbi Jacobson told me to keep it. God told me to keep it. And not to say I'm God, I just meant two votes. And you'll have, in your mind, in your heart, you'll feel you made a deal with God. You keep your Shabbos, and God's going to take care of you. Then months may pass, and let's say it doesn't work out, that your parnasa is being supplemented, and your pocketbook is starting to pinch. And then you're going to get angry at God and at me. I don't really care about me, but you're going to get angry that God didn't complete His end of the bargain. Because that's what people do. And that's my concern. So if you make the decision knowing full well what you're getting into, and yes, there are risks, and I'm not saying God won't provide, but it doesn't always work the way you think, and sometimes there are different challenges that we have, and so on. It doesn't always work exactly as you think it's going to work. So and also, this is Shabbos. What else do I know about your life? I don't know, for all I know, you're doing things that are so antithetical to everything else, and not that I'm judging you. But hey, you like Shabbos. It felt good to you. It's like a nice warm table. They sing. There's good food. It feels like home. All good things. Anyway, of course, he was upset. He didn't like what I said. And let me tell you what happened. He did not listen, which is fine with me. He kept Shabbos, which one would think, wow, I should have been ecstatic. And I didn't mind. I knew that he was. And I thought, great. That's his decision. But I was, in my mind, I thought, okay, let's see. And And what happened was, that's exactly what I predicted happened. A few months passed, and things weren't going, it wasn't being booked, didn't find alternatives, and he got really angry. He got angry at everybody, all the rabbis in the synagogues, and at me. Again, it doesn't bother me that he was angry at me. That was not the issue. But I remember he dropped everything. Today he's a Shabbos observant Jew, and learned, because he grew into it. First he got angry, then he came back, and this was exactly what happened. So what happened to him was similar to the same idea. It's critical, and I'm not suggesting. As I said, if he had kept Shabbos, I would have been the happiest person. Many rabbis have said to me, "I have influence on different individuals." I do. Why don't you tell them to put on tefillin or do this? I don't tell people what to do, not because I'm afraid to tell people, because I think adults have to make decisions themselves. I could encourage, I could educate, teach, inspire. I also don't feel that I'm going to get points if I make people frum. It's not my thing, And I also don't. And my goal is to bring people, give them options they may not have known, and let them now work it out with God, just like I have to work out my issues with God. It's really straightforward like that. People ask me, is your goal to make me religious or to make others religious? No, my goal is to open up options you may not have heard before in the Torah, Judaism, and then, as an adult, hopefully you'll embrace. And if you don't embrace, we're still best friends. I'm not looking. It's not about that. It's about everybody's journey, and the journey is a sacred journey. As long as you're honest. If I see somebody being dishonest and I also not necessarily will say something, because that people have that right to be dishonest as well. But then it's a different thing. Then you're just looking for excuses. But if a person is honest in their journey with God, I don't know. There is no rule what pace. Every one of us has a different pace. Two people, you can't expect that two people with different backgrounds and different personalities have to go exactly the same speed. This isn't a selling shoes, where you expect someone bought one pair of shoes, you hope that in the next quarter they'll buy another pair of shoes. This doesn't work that way. This is a number. It's not a numbers game. It's a complex relationship with the divine. It's about a complicated journey. And as long as we are going with good open hearts and with an honesty and integrity, that's what we're asked for. Some have to go faster. Great. Some people say to me, I'd like to go to Israel, go study a few months. What do you think? I don't per se have a negative thing. I'll say to the person, I really will challenge them and see whether this is really a mature adult decision they're making, or because they heard a speech last Friday night and they feel guilty, or they just were caught up in the euphoria of others doing it. Which, again, is not necessarily a bad thing per se, but you have to be aware that that's what's happening. But not just to go into this type of cloud nine and illusions. It's critical to be realistic. At the same time, absolutely inspired. That's why I think it's a balance, and it's not one or the other. So practically, I would advise all of you, if you're touched by the fire, in one way or other, not to get burned by it. You have to talk to someone that's objective. Find someone you can trust. Find someone that trusts you, more importantly, and your tools. Not someone who's going to tell you what to do. I think you should do this, I think you should do that. And you can tell how a person will ask you questions. If they just tell you yes or no, do this, do that, it's usually not a good sign. They'll ask you questions. Where do you stand? Where you're up to? I remember when one guy, where I almost fell off my chair, when he told me, he used to come to this class, and I knew he had to go a very slow pace. Today he's an observant Jew, married to a beautiful woman, they have a beautiful home with a child and so on. But it took years. He had to go at his pace, and that was fine. One day he calls me, he's moving to Jerusalem. And this guy was a hotshot in Hollywood, in the music world. And I said to him, I said, yeah, I bought a house in the old city, and I'm moving. And I said, what? And he's the guy that asked me years earlier, are you expecting me one day to wear a long black coat and move to Crown Heights? And I said, if you do that, I'll never speak to you again the rest of my life. So now he's telling me he's moving to the old city in Jerusalem. And I said to him, so why there, of all places? Can't get closer to the... He says, listen, you taught me about this. I got inspired. Now I want to have box seats. He wants to be there right by the... So I said... Anyway, I said, I disturbed. I said to him, listen, just drop your whole life, in California, in LA and all that. He said that. But after I spoke to him for a while, I saw that it was definitely coming from a healthier place. And it wasn't like I met him after a week. This was knowing him over 8 years. So, it's not like he needed my blessing. He was doing it whether I agreed or didn't agree. But I remember just my attitude to it was the same reaction. Not that I have a problem with it. I think it was beautiful that he did it in concept. But I'm always concerned because it's vital that it be contained and balanced. So this week's portion has very relevant messages to the bad and good religious experiences in our lives. And I hope that we all can get something out of it. And I think it's vital because, look, we all are looking for deeper truths. I don't think you'd be sitting here if you didn't feel that way, as I am. And it's very important to have both the humility, the passion, and the pacing. The bottom line is to really have the balance of all those items. That's when you really will grow into the healthiest you can be. Will we make mistakes? Absolutely. All of us make mistakes sometimes. Not even sure whether you should move faster, not move faster. I don't want to either leave a message here tonight as well that people should start becoming so cautious that you don't make any moves. That's not at all what I'm intending. It's just really thinking about it from all angles, really. And looking at moves you make and understanding and realizing that we don't live in a very perfect world. I always tell people who are telling me today that they feel alone, they got disappointed in the Jewish communities they were around. I mean, they find here and there they have special people they know, but they basically disillusioned. I said to them, you know something? I personally think that's, I say this to people who I know well and trust me. I wouldn't say it to anybody. I say, look, you're not talking to me like a baby. You want to talk like an adult. Take the bull by the horns. And why are you blaming others? You're also part of the community, the Jewish community. Now, except you're the one that's complaining about it. So build. You reach out, be proactive, find other people like yourself. Don't just sit around and wait for a community that's going to save your life. That's how I feel. When a person's truly growing, take responsibility. What I mean by that is don't you have to become a rabbi or a leader of a community. It means not just to play a victim. It's true, very true that there are many communities that are very disappointing and you don't want to be part of them. But how are we going to ever correct this if we don't all, as a grassroots group, do something? And there are many ways, there are many suggestions. So it's vital as well, if a person's in that situation, not just to say, oh, look, because we can get caught in that trap of just saying how bad things are. And like we're so aware that they're bad, and we're like so enlightened by that. The question is there any action being done by it? And I look at myself. I'm very familiar with the communities of Judaism. I've been around. I grew up in a very traditional community. I've traveled extensively. I know what's happening. Yet, I see my life not as looking and saying, oh, look how bad it is. It's, what are we going to do to make it different? I try to I see myself as a bridge between establishment and anti-establishment. So in my heart, I'm really very anti-establishment, for the record. But I also understand that you have to work within the structures, and you want to make sure that you're not just looked at as another rebel, and that's another way to dismiss. So you have to know how to really dance the dance. I'm not suggesting all of you here have to do that, but we have to be allies here in the sense of not just being in that. I could definitely be a sympathetic ear to people who've been burned by the fires. I've seen plenty of stuff that's not nice and not beautiful at all. So I'm not suggesting and validating negative experience people have had. But the question is, just like it is with all healing, is there comes a point you don't want to just talk about how bad your mother and father were. You want to start saying, okay, so what kind of life are you going to build now? So yes, there are some very bad influences in the Jewish communities. There are some ghetto attitudes, there are brainwashing attitudes, there are programming, there's condescension, there's a lot of stuff, abuse as well. But it's the same situation. That doesn't mean Judaism is that way, it doesn't mean Torah is that way. So what are we going to do about making a difference? So it's true, we could either be part of the problem, or we can be outside of the whole thing and just watch, or we can be part of the solution. I would say those that are part of the problem within, and those that are on the outside who've been hurt, looking outside, are also part of the problem. Just a different end of it. And what we need is the third category, people who are strong enough to not allow the hurt to stop them from forward progress. So, what we learn from Nadav and Avihu is that we can march forward. They got burned for all of us. We don't need to go through that again. You can read their story again and again and learn from it. And our job is to integrate the fire, passionate fire, love, the devotion, the hunger, the spiritual hunger, but in ways that are integrated. So, on that happy note, I'd like to say to everybody a very good night. And watch out for the fires all around. But don't stay too far either, because you won't get warm. And it's a balance. So good night to everybody, and good night to the lovely cyberspace audience.